anche quest'anno qui a Ginevra si tiene l'Expert Mechanism on the Right of Indigenous People, un meccanismo che ha lo scopo di tutelare che venga applicata la Carta dei diritti dei popoli indigeni approvata dall'ONU nel 2007. Qui a Ginevra, nell'ambito dei diritti umani, questo working group raduna esperti indigeni da tutto il mondo e affronta tutti quei temi che sono legati alla giustizia, ai diritti, a tutto quello che riguarda la tutela delle tradizioni, delle identità dei popoli indigeni.
El ser humano, la familia, la naturaleza, el mundo, la violencia, lo vamos a dejar allá y vamos a pedir para eso que la fuerza de la madre, Settima, de la madre tierra, esté siempre en nuestro corazón, como generosidad, con solidaridad. Settima. Settima. Miramos hacia el sur, donde están los guardianes del agua, y vamos a pedir que nuestra claridad sea como la de la vida. En nombre de los pueblos indígenas del mundo, agradecemos este espacio, esta oportunidad.
President of the Human Rights Council, Indigenous peoples representatives, and delegates. I would like to thank my colleagues of the expert mechanism for the trust that they bestow upon me to serve as the chairperson of the expert mechanism.
What is the purpose of your work here at the United Nations?
The main purpose, I would say, is the official recognition of Crimean Tatar people, first of all, but not only of them, in a capacity of indigenous population and indigenous peoples of Crimea, which logically should produce the range of the legal and political consequences for these peoples, who are Crimean Tatars, Karaites, Krimchaks, and Urums. All of them were, appeared, maybe said, during the historical process in Crimean Peninsula, which are very close one each other in anthropology and culture, but who are different by their religion, because Crimean Tatars, the biggest one, people are Sunni Muslims. Karaims have their special branch of Abrahamic religion, which is not very famous in comparison with Christianity and Judaism and Islam, because Karaites is the branch of this Abrahamic root of religion. Krimchaks, who are Jews by their religion, and Urums, who are Orthodoxes.
And you are a representative of a tribe in particular, or all indigenous people of Crimea?
Well, me personal, I'm Crimean Tatar, but I'm head of organization which is called the Foundation for Research and Support of Indigenous Peoples of Crimea, and in our activity we try to cover interests not only of Crimean Tatars but of all indigenous peoples of Crimea.
There are many problems for indigenous people in Crimea, I think.
A lot, because still, until now, mostly these peoples are not recognized neither like peoples nor like indigenous peoples in particular. all regimes who dealt with all these peoples preferred to look to them like to ethnic groups or national minorities or something like this. And for comparison, we have some communities of Crimean Tatars in Romania, for example, contemporary Romania, who are our diaspora, but in cultural and social life they are more strong than Crimean Tatars in Crimea. Karais in their language, Karais or Karais, they have the small group in Lithuania, which is non-comparable, better protected by the Lithuanian state, where they are diaspora of Crimea than inside of Crimea. So, of course, it is connected with the point that all new comers in Crimea, new settlers, new populations, and their authority, the first, their majority, the second, they prefer to escape any kind of the recognition of the rights of indigenous population in order to possess all natural resources of Crimea, all land of Crimea, without any observations or without any obligations towards the indigenous peoples. This is main point.
And what do you expect from this mechanism?
Well, very hard question. I don't wait something very straight, from the today's activity of mechanism. I started to come to Geneva in the era of working group in indigenous populations in 1994, and I would say that I couldn't say about some separate achievement, but as a trend, first of all, the Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples was adopted, despite the Ukrainian government, who possess of Crimea, by international law, abstained at the time of the voting for declaration. But due to the recent developments, I mean this international conflict between Russia, who pretend to be master of Crimea, and Ukrainian parliament and consequently government officially recognized the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and recognized Crimean Tatars like indigenous peoples of Crimea. De facto is a little bit late because Ukrainian state does not control the territory of Crimea now, so this is a recognition outside, which don't influences to the position of Russian government, maybe even vice versa, in contradiction to this Russian government, who factually control Crimean territory now since several months past. They again, like Ukraine at the very beginning, tried to escape any considerations of the autochthonous population of Crimea, like indigenous peoples. They say everybody is equal, everything should be decided by the voting, preliminary understanding that the Crimean Tatars and other indigenous peoples are less than 20% of population, and any voting is de facto depriving of any perspective to recognize their rights.
We talked before about the links between Italy and Crimea. Can you say something?
There, in comparison with some parts of the world which were so-called discovered recently, I mean 500 years ago, 600 years ago, even 100 years ago, Crimea was at the crossroad, or one of the crossroads of the world civilization, European civilization, and connections between Crimea and Italy, contemporary Italy, go back to ancient time, because we have the cities or towns in Crimea from ancient Greece and consequently from the Roma period, including Byzance period, and one of our indigenous peoples who are Rums, they go back to the mixture between local population and settlers from Byzantine Empire, means Eastern Romanian Empire. So they have, even in blood and culture and cultural manifestations, some parts maybe very ancient of Romanian culture and Italian culture, but we even have rather fresh mixture with the Italians, because we had since the 15th century we had colonies in Crimea, Genoese and Venetians, mostly in Sudak and Feodosia, or Kaffa of that time, and small castles over the sea. What is it? Coast. And in some groups of Crimean Tatars, practically Genoveses were substrate who was Turkicized, Muslimanized, and became Crimean Tatars. By their anthropology, by some of their music, style of life, etc., they're very close to the medieval Genoveses still now, and they even remember a little bit that some generations ago they were Catholics and they were Genoveses or Venetians. Of course, now we are compact nation with because Italians, for example, are mixed nation with different. Yes, the same way. But it's rather well known among Crimean Tatars that from that village or that part of that town, people are mostly Genoveses by their origin.
We are relatives.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you very much. Nell'ambito dell'Expert Mechanism on the Right of Indigenous People si tiene il seminario Giustizia e diritti per le nostre generazioni passate, presenti e future, a cura del Youth Indigenous Caucus.
Working for rights and justice for our past, current, and future generations. We have an array of panelists who are very experienced in the realm of whether it's fighting against extractive industries or fighting for Indigenous human rights from a younger generational perspective, but as well as those with current experience in ensuring that Indigenous rights are achieved.
In your speech, you talk about things very moving, no? But you think that is really possible a reconciliation process?
I think that the process of reconciliation is possible, but as Willie Littlechild was saying and I stated, it's important to remember that you have to reconcile with yourself. So when I was sharing my story, filled with anger and trauma and self-hatred, it was really integral for me to really recognize all these feelings were my own, and all these stories that were coming up for me were my own. And I was holding on to all this stuff within myself, and I wasn't allowing it to let go. And the only way to heal that was to recognize that it was okay to feel those, but it was also important to let those go. So that was the first step in my own reconciliation. And from there, you can allow it to lead out to the community, to family, to the nation, and hopefully to the colonizer or the oppressor, and hopefully that relationship can be a better one.
The government of Canada had a policy, a stated policy, to kill the Indian in the child. That was the admitted policy, to kill the Indian in the child. So it was, secondly, a legislated assimilation. Parents did not have a choice on this matter. So what the policy was that children were taken from their parents and put into residential schools. 150,000 children were taken and placed in over 130 schools across Canada. So the question arises, when you do that, what happens to the child that's taken from their parents? What happens to the child when you pull them away from their parents at 6 years old and you put them into a school and they don't have a chance to go home?
This situation that you described the Discovery Doctrine had a big responsibility for this situation, about youth, about abuse, stolen generations, and so on.
Yes, thank you for that very important observation. At the Permanent Forum, when they studied the Doctrine of Discovery, I did a presentation because we made that link all the way back to the Doctrine of Discovery. The residential school policy has origins within the Doctrine of Discovery. The dispossession, the whole notion of terra nullius where nobody exists. Because if you look at the policy of the residential schools, the purpose was to Christianize and to civilize. Well, that's the Doctrine of Discovery. There's a direct link to that doctrine. And I made that presentation in New York at the Permanent Forum. So I think it's reflected in some of their own research that they did. And I believe it's in the report. So yes, that link is definitely there, because when they were asked, why did you do this? Well, these are heathens, they're not Christians, they're pagans. We have to Christianize them. In order to Christianize and civilize them, we have to take the children away from them. So, and to educate them and civilize them, we'll put them into these schools. So there's a very direct link. The other link you should look at is the murdered and missing Aboriginal women in Canada. The murdered and Aboriginal women in Canada situation is directly linked to the residential school experience. So we made that link as well, not just jumping into that conclusion, but actually based on some research.
But Discovery Doctrine is still alive. Perhaps Indigenous people have to ask the Church to close Discovery Doctrine. So for a real process of reconciliation, it's important, this point, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And in Canada, we've had an apology from the United Church, because they were one of the 4 churches that were in the schools. The Anglican Church has apologized. The Presbyterian Church has apologized. The difficult one, unfortunately, and they ran 70% of the schools, is the Catholic Church. So when we met with the Pope, he expressed regret that this had happened, and it should never happen, and we should move on. But the problem with that is, to many of the survivors, that's not good enough. They want to hear the words, "I'm sorry for what happened to you. I'm sorry for what we did to you. I'm sorry." But he didn't say that. He just expressed regret that happened, right? So yesterday's meeting with the child abuse people in the Vatican by the Pope was really significant. So I think that opens the door with the new Pope, with willingness to do that, to come to residential school survivors and express that apology. And say it as an apology, not as a third-party expression of regret. You know what I mean? So anyway, thank you for raising that. Yes, there's a link to the doctrine, and there's also the important need to hear an apology, because it gives you an opportunity to forgive. And once you forgive, then you can begin your healing journey. Point of reconciliation is with yourself. One of the elders said, for example, you have to reconcile with Creator, or God, or however you acknowledge a higher spirit. You reconcile yourself with your own past. She talked about anger. After very intensive counseling, I was made aware that I was a very angry man. And I thought, well, no, I'm not. And the counselor, yes, you are. No, I'm not. You're very angry. No, I'm not. You know, it's good. So she walked me through, and she said, you have to go back to your childhood when you were taken. How old were you when you were taken? So I had asked people, my auntie, She said, you were 2.5 weeks old. So now my counselor is telling me to go back to that time of my life. So it was a real hard journey for me to go back, to try and dig how I would cry when I was 2.5 weeks old.
What is the main purpose of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus?
Well, the main purpose of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus is to create a space for all collective voices of youth from all over the world, particularly all regions where indigenous peoples have lands, territories, and resources. And the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus is a group where we network and where we share information and we coordinate work towards the United Nations mechanisms, such as the Permanent Forum, such as the expert mechanism of the rights of indigenous peoples, but it's not limited to that. There are also other United Nations areas that we work towards for as a collective. The Global Indigenous Youth Caucus is divided into regions, and each regions have focal points.
Yes.
So there are focal points for regions up to 2 persons or 3 persons, because there are regions such as where I come from, like Asia. It's very big, so we require more than 1 focal person that will coordinate the grassroots youth and bring them to a collective process straight up to the higher levels in the United Nations. So this is the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus and our work for coordinating and collectively voicing out our aspirations, our issues, and most importantly, our vision for the future. We have members from all over the world, and we are also we have a decision-making process on our own, where we decide our leadership, which is our chairman. We have 3 chairs, so they are co-chairs on their own. One is from East Asia, Jocelyn. We have one from the Sami peoples, which is Tomos, and then also from North America we have Sky, and Sky just joined us as a co-chair this year. So a big work, yes. So the work for a focal person is to help coordinate and to bring the youth together in any of the United Nations meetings, such as this time in Nattero.
Giancarlo Barbadoro, presidente della Eco Spirituality Foundation, è promotore del Native European Caucus, un'iniziativa in formazione. Sentiamo di cosa si tratta.
È un'iniziativa molto interessante che coinvolge la cultura, diciamo, dei nativi europei, chiamiamola così, perché oggi come oggi non esistono definizioni storiche che possono darle un posto. E il lavoro del Caucus è quello di mettere in piedi un insieme di comunità di ispirazione druidica, di ispirazione celtica, che in poche parole si portino a creare una forza culturale ben precisa che si possa manifestare. È un lavoro molto difficile perché queste comunità temono ancora, sull'onda delle antiche persecuzioni ricevute dall'epoca appunto diciamo di Costantino sino ad oggi, fino a ieri, ma oggi non è escluso, tanto più che la Discovery Doctrine è ancora in auge e quindi non è ancora stata cancellata. Hanno paura di mostrarsi e quindi hanno paura che le loro terre che utilizzano in segreto possano essere confiscate, che i loro santuari possano essere distrutti. Sono santuari che tengono in maniera molto diciamo discreta, li tengono diciamo segreti, ecco. È un lavoro molto difficile, ma io conto di riuscire a smuovere qualcosa. Ci sono delle comunità, torno a dire che abbiamo preso contatto qua, ma ci sono delle comunità dove Dreamland sta agendo in questo momento, cioè ovvero la sede morale della Eco Spirituality Foundation, che praticamente porta a valutare che nel Nord Piemonte ci sono anche lì delle comunità. Vedremo cosa riusciremo a fare.
Your impression about this session of expert mechanism?
Well, I think it's like past sessions. It's a very important session on the agenda items that we had to discuss. But this year is particularly important because of the World Conference that's coming up. And it was important that we hear from delegations from states and from indigenous peoples and others their views on what should be included in the World Conference. So it was very important from that perspective. It was a different dynamic because of that, I think, but it was still important.
About your work like Commissioner of Truth and Reconciliation, do you think is really possible reconciliation? You believe in this?
Well, I have to believe that it's possible because of the work that I do and the harm that was done. So in looking back at the past 5 years for which I was engaged on the Truth Commission, I think there's some very good acts of reconciliation beginning to happen. And because of that, there's some good healing that's starting in the community. So that is encouraging. That encourages me to keep working on the difficult challenge of reconciliation. Because sometimes it's not clear what it means. So we need to begin, I think, from individual perspective and then from there go outwards. So it is a difficult challenge, but at the same time I'm being encouraged already, as I say, from what I've seen happening in the communities.
Do you think it's not the risk that reconciliation means assimilation by the majority society and the historical religions?
Actually, I think it's the reverse. When we ask people, what did you lose? What was lost in this experience? Many times they refer to culture and language and self-esteem and pride as indigenous people. So reconciliation is putting some of that back, encouraging people to relearn their language that if they've lost it, also relearn the experiences, the cultural ceremonies that we have, the sacred ceremonies that we have, because that brings back the pride in the individual. So I think it strengthens the individual aspect of the spiritual element, the ceremonial element, the sacred element, and also the self-identity. And if you have that strength, then assimilation will not happen. Yes. So I think it's the reverse. I think it's encouraging us to go back to our own ways and culture.
In the majority society in this world, the humanity is ill, the planet is ill, and perhaps the only hope for the humanity is just in the indigenous people. You think so?
Well, I know that we still have traditional leaders and elders who have traditional knowledge about how to take care of Mother Earth, the connection to the environment and to the land especially. As a part of our work, we learned, for example, if you want to reconcile, go to the bush, go by the river, and talk to the trees, talk to the river. But they say, more importantly, listen to what the trees are saying, listen to what the river is saying, listen to the wind and the air. And so we have this traditional knowledge holders that have the way to advise us or inform us on how to protect Mother Earth. So I think that accessing that knowledge now is critical. It's critically important because we're beginning to lose those knowledge holders. So there again, I think that the experience that we had with seeking the truth about what happened, how do we recover from that, and how do we reconcile together so that we have mutual and respectful relationships going forward. So I think it's critical that we as I say, utilize the traditional knowledge that's there right now with knowledge keepers. So yes, I think there's not only an opportunity there, but a good optimism. But we need to act right away.
Yes. Indigenous people are very different, but they have something in common. I think, is a spiritually a view of spirituality in common. Is that?
Yes, I think that's the common thread that holds us all together, the spiritual aspect of our way of life. And it doesn't matter what language you speak, what tribe you belong to, which ceremonies that you do. The one common element throughout all of the indigenous peoples, and I would say even further than that, all of humankind is the spiritual aspect, the spiritual element. But there again, we need to go back to the spiritual elements. We can't leave them behind, or we can't exchange them in a way. So we have to rely back on the traditional knowledge keepers of our sacred ceremonies, for example. So the spirituality of indigenous peoples is common, but also over the years I've seen that contribution here at the United Nations. As I was saying at one of the sessions, that I remember when I was asked to ask the chairperson if we could say a prayer, an invocation, a thanksgiving. And I was told we don't do that at the United Nations. But now, as we just saw, a closing ceremony with a spiritual element, it's been introduced here so that it helps us keep it alive, but it also helps us share it with other cultures, that we do have this common. It's interesting because in ceremonies, it doesn't matter the languages that are spoken, the spiritual connection is the same.
Your impression about this session?
Well, I thought it was a very interesting session. I think the whole issue of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples was like a cloud over the whole session. And I guess it was a distraction, really. Because the zero draft was not ready on time, it pushed the agenda had to change. Well, what was impressive was the number of states that were in the room. There was an enormous number of states, more than normal, and so we hope that this is a trend that'll continue, and that'll depend on, of course, how effective the experts can be in producing their studies and making them relevant to Indigenous people and to states.
Yes.
So I think that's an interesting step forward for this particular session.
The work is very hard and very big, no?
Well, the studies that the expert mechanisms do are important, and also they do this with very little resources, and I think that's why some studies take more than 1 year to do. So you have to do 2 years because there are not enough resources. The UN does not give the expert mechanism enough resources to do a high quality study the first time, so they got to do it twice.
From the Potomac Project Nation. I am very honored to do this ceremony, the 4 directions, honoring our ancestors, honoring our elders, our children, our spiritual people. must say to the West, now to the heart of the sky and to the heart of the earth. Children, the medicine of Mother Earth.